they brought her out at dusk. That was the cruelest part, the hour chosen with intention, when the dying light bled copper and ash across the sky, and the torches along the council hall had just been lit, their orange glow catching every face in the gathered crowd, like firelight catching the eyes of wolves. The hour when shadows were long, and everything looked like a reckoning. Someone had chosen dusk on purpose. Pam understood that, even now, just with her wrists bound and the wolfsbane cord eating slow fire into her skin. She walked with her chin up. Not rope around her wrists. Wolfsbane cord, the kind that burned low and steady, a constant reminder of exactly what she was being made into. The cord was thinner than she'd expected when they'd bound her in the holding room, almost delicate-looking, woven from dried and treated herb in tight spirals of gray-green. But every step she took across the packed earth of the pack square, she felt it at her pulse points. A quiet, insistent fire that sent signals up her arms and into her chest, telling her she was contained, controlled, reduced. She kept her eyes forward and did not look down at it. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her study her own restraints. She looked ahead instead. The crowd had gathered on both sides of the path like two walls of living judgment, and she walked the narrow corridor between them. The square smelled of torch smoke and autumn mud and the faint mineral tang of cold stone. The same smells it had always had. The smells of every festival, every pack gathering, every ordinary evening she had walked through this place without anyone watching. Now every eye was on her. She recognized every face. Old Mary, who had taught her to weave as a child, who used to press dried lavender into her small palms and tell her the plants remembered those who loved them. The blacksmith Torin, his thick arms crossed over his leather apron, jaw set hard, refusing to let his eyes quite meet hers. The miller's daughters, who had been her friends until 2 summers ago, now standing close together with their hands linked, as if proximity to each other could protect them from whatever she had become. She had once been desired by every young wolf in this pack. That felt like something that had happened to another girl entirely. A girl with an uncomplicated future. A girl whose name her parents spoke with pride rather than apology. She remembered being that girl. She had liked her. She still grieved her sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the strange heat rose at the back of her throat, and the words came whether she invited them or not. But that grief was a private thing. It did not belong to the people watching her walk this path. The council platform rose at the end of the square. 3 wide stone steps leading to a raised dais, where 7 elders sat in carved chairs that had always struck Pam, even as a child, as something between furniture and theater. Elder Marcus sat at the center, the eldest among them, his white hair loose around his shoulders, and his silver-streaked robes pressed into careful folds. He was an old man, older than most wolves allowed themselves to become, and his face had the particular quality of ancient things. It had stopped showing what it felt long ago, and now simply showed what it was. Unmovable. Final. His pale gray eyes were already on her when she climbed the first step. They had been on her since she emerged from the holding room's low doorway into the dying light. Pam climbed all 3 steps. Her legs did not tremble. She made very sure of that. Elder Marcus rose. "Pamela Dawnfield," he said, and his voice carried across the square the way only a pack elders could. Deep, unhurried, absolute. A voice that knew it would be heard and had therefore never learned the habit of urgency. "You are brought before this council by the testimony of your own blood." Her own blood. Her eyes found them then, because she could not stop herself, because some part of her had been dreading this moment and hoping for it in equal measure. Needing to see their faces, needing to know if they truly understood what they had done. Her parents stood to the left of the platform, slightly apart from the crowd in the way that people stood when they no longer quite knew which group they belonged to. Too close to the accused to be comfortably anonymous. Too aligned with the council to stand at her side. Her mother's hands were clasped at her waist, knuckles pale. Her gaze cast down at the earth in front of her, as if she had found something profoundly interesting there. Her father stood very straight. His chin was lifted, and he was wearing his good cloak, the dark one with the silver clasp, the one he saved for the high feast days and the solstice ceremonies and occasions that mattered. He had dressed for this. He had looked at his wardrobe this morning, looked at his good cloak, and thought, yes, this is an occasion. Something in Pam's chest went very still and very quiet, the way a forest went quiet just before a tree finally gave way and fell. That stillness was not peace. It was the absence of something that would take a long time to name. Aldrich and Marta Dawnfield have brought formal accusation, Elder Marcus continued. They attest that their daughter has, over a period of months, displayed episodes of unknown origin, speaking in tongues not belonging to any living language, entering states of trance that cannot be explained by natural means, and demonstrating behaviors consistent with spirit corruption or darker influence. Spirit corruption. The words landed in the square, and the crowd rippled, a collective shift of unease that ran through the gathered bodies like wind through standing grain. She heard a child somewhere near the back ask its mother a quiet question and be swiftly hushed. She saw a man near the front touch the iron amulet at his throat. Small gestures, old instincts. The kind people reached for when they were frightened and needed to feel like the frightening thing was contained. She was the frightening thing. She understood this. She had understood it for a long time. The accused has provided no satisfactory explanation for these episodes, Elder Marcus said. And as the welfare and purity of this pack is the first duty of this council, we are called to render judgment. He looked at her, truly looked, and past the ceremony of it, with something that was almost reluctance. Is there anything you wish to say before this council deliberates? Pam opened her mouth, and for a moment, just a moment, something else nearly came out instead. She felt it the way she always felt it, a swelling warmth that started at the base of her spine and rose through her chest and gathered at the back of her throat. Those syllables assembling themselves out of nothing, that ancient architecture of sound that had no place in any language she had ever been taught, and yet lived in her as fluently as breath. Her jaw tightened, her lips pressed together. She swallowed it back down hard, and the wolfsbane cord burned sharper at her wrists as if it could sense her resistance. I am not corrupted, she said instead. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. I don't know what is happening to me. I have never known what it is. But I have harmed no one in this pack. I have never raised a hand, never spoken a curse, never wished destruction on anyone here. Whatever this is, her voice nearly broke on the word, and she caught it, held it, pressed through. It came to me. I did not go looking for it. You have frightened half this pack, her father's voice, not Elder Marcus's. Her father stepping forward from his place beside her mother, his voice carrying clearly across the square because he had pitched it that way, and because the crowd was the audience, not her. You stand before us and speak of harm, but what do you call what you have done to this family? To your mother? To our name? The words hit her the way cold water did. Total. Encompassing. Taking the breath. She turned to face him fully. She looked at the man who had taught her to track through the northern wood, who had carried her on his shoulders as a small child so she could touch the high branches of the old pine at the edge of the village, who had held her hand during her first change and told her, quietly and with a certainty she had believed entirely, that she was going to be all right. Father, she said. Just that. Just his name. Just the fact of him. He looked away from her. We stand before this council, he said to the elders, still not meeting her eyes, his voice measured and carrying and completely, devastatingly resolved, as her parents, and we are the first to say that we do not recognize our daughter in what she has become. The girl we raised, she is not what stands before you now. We ask the council for judgment, for the pack's sake, for our own." The silence that followed was the longest and worst thing Pam had ever endured. It had texture, that silence, weight and heat, and the particular cruel patience of a crowd that knows it is watching something it will describe to its children. The torches crackled. A horse somewhere behind the square stamped and shifted. Her mother had not moved, had not spoken, had not raised her eyes from the ground. Elder Marcus sat back slowly. He exchanged looks with the council members on either side. Brief, efficient, already arrived. "The council will deliberate," he said. "The accused will—" "Wait." The voice came from the far edge of the dais, from the deep shadow at the back of the platform that Pam, in her focus on the elders and her parents, and the act of simply remaining upright, had not fully registered. Later she would wonder about that. Later she would wonder if she had been meant not to notice until the precise moment she was supposed to. The woman who stepped forward was not tall. She moved with the contained economy of someone who had decided, long ago, exactly how much of herself she would reveal, and how much she would withhold, and had perfected the ratio. Her robes were not the practical wool of the village or the ceremonial silver of the elders. They were layered, deep gray, and at the collar and cuffs ran a pattern of embroidered symbols that seemed to shift in the torchlight. Or perhaps it was only the flickering of the flames that made them appear to move. Her dark hair was shot through with silver, and drawn back with a precision that spoke of both ceremony and daily discipline. Her face was still, composed, the face of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. When she stepped fully into the light, every face in the crowd turned. It was not like the way they had watched Pam walk into the square. That had been the attention of a crowd watching something dangerous. This was the attention of people in the presence of something they respected and were slightly afraid of in a different, more considered way. Priestess Sora, even Elder Marcus with his centuries of accumulated authority and his impeccable ceremonial stillness, went slightly quiet. "Forgive the interruption," Sora said, and there was no apology whatsoever in her voice. She stopped near the edge of the dais and turned her gaze to Pam. It was a searching gaze, careful, thorough, moving over her face and then to the bound wrists and then back to her face, and it had the quality of something that was not merely looking, but reading. "I have been observing this matter for some time." "Priestess Sora," Elder Marcus said with care, "the council is grateful for your presence, but the deliberation process will result in a death sentence," Sora said pleasantly, as one states a simple fact about weather or harvest. "We all know this. The law on spirit corruption is not ambiguous." A brief pause. "I am proposing an alternative." The crowd stirred, an audible shift. Pam's heart was hammering so hard she felt it at every pulse point. Her throat, her temples, her bound wrists where the wolfsbane cord still burned. She pressed her bound hands against her sternum and breathed. "What alternative?" Elder Marcus asked. "Release her to my custody," Sora said. Her dark eyes had not left Pam's face since she'd begun speaking. "I will take her to my keep at the northern wood's edge. I will study what she is, the nature of these episodes, their source, their pattern. I will report my findings to this council before the season turns. If she is corrupted as accused, I will return her for judgment." Another pause, precise as a blade's edge. "But if she is something else? Something we do not yet have a name for? Then perhaps judgment is not what this moment calls for." The square was quiet enough that the torches sounded loud. Elder Marcus looked at Pam, at her father, who had gone unreadable, at the council members beside him, finally back at Sora, who waited with the infinite patience of someone who had already determined the outcome. "The council will consider," he said. "Please do," Sora replied. She folded her hands. The embroidered symbols at her collar caught the torchlight and seemed again to move. Though I will say this, whatever she is, she did not choose it. And we have never yet burned what we did not first understand. The deliberation took less than 10 minutes. When Elder Marcus rose again, Pam was watching Sora. The priestess stood at the far edge of the dais, still and composed, hands folded, the torchlight warm on her composed face. As if she felt the gaze, she turned. Their eyes met. Sora offered a small, measured smile, the kind that was shaped specifically for the recipient, precise in its dimensions. Something in Pam loosened. Gratitude, flooding warm through her chest, cresting into something that felt like hope. Someone had intervened. Someone had stepped in front of the sentence, had offered a hand, had seen something in her worth preserving instead of punishing. She was saved. She did not yet understand the difference between being saved and being kept. The council accepts Priestess Sora's proposal, Elder Marcus announced. Pamela Dawnfield is remanded to the priestess's custody pending full investigation. The wolfsbane cord will be removed. She will depart with the priestess before sunrise tomorrow. Pam exhaled, a long, unsteady breath that she had been holding for so long her ribs ached. She had promised herself she would not break in front of them. She had kept the promise for the whole of the walk across the square, through her father's words and her mother's silence and Elder Marcus's ancient, patient voice. The breath came out shaky anyway. She could not stop that. She looked for her parents. Her mother had finally lifted her eyes. They were wet. Not crying, not quite, but holding the moisture of someone standing at the threshold of grief, who has not yet decided whether to step through it. Her expression was complicated in the way of people who have done something irreversible and are beginning to understand what irreversible means. She took one small step toward Pam. Her father's hand came to her arm. A quiet gesture. Restraining. Not comforting. Her mother stopped. Looked down again. Pam turned away from them and followed Sora's attendant down the steps, through the crowd that parted without being asked, into the cool shadow at the edge of the square. She did not look back. She had given them one chance to be something other than what they had chosen to be tonight, and they had shown her clearly what they were. She would carry that clearly. She would not romanticize it. But as they passed beyond the last torch's reach, into the dark cool of the lane leading north, Pam heard it, faint, at the very base of her throat, the place where the ancient heat always gathered before the words came. Not words yet. A single sound, half-syllable, sourceless and warm, shade like an ember that had been smothered and was beginning, quietly, to breathe again. As if whatever lived inside her recognized the direction they were walking, and was already, in its ancient and unhurried way, beginning to stir. 3 paces ahead, Priestess Sora slowed, just fractionally, just enough. Then she continued walking, and in the darkness beyond the torches, beyond any watching eye, the corners of her mouth curved upward. It was not entirely a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had found exactly what she had come looking for, and could not quite conceal how long she had been searching. Sora's keep was beautiful. That was the first thing Pam noticed when they arrived at dawn, the sky behind the structure bleeding from deep violet into a pale and watery gold, the northern pines standing sentinel on either side of the path, as if they had been arranged by design rather than nature. The keep itself was not large, not a fortress, not the kind of stone-heavy stronghold that pack elders built to announce their importance. It was older than that. Low and wide, built from dark river stone that had been smoothed by centuries of weather into something almost soft-looking, its walls draped in climbing ivy that had gone autumn red at the edges, still green at its heart. Narrow windows, a heavy arched door of dark wood, iron-banded, standing slightly open as though the building had been expecting them. It smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and something underneath those things. Something mineral and ancient, like turned earth just after rain. Like something sleeping, very deep down, that had been asleep for a very long time. Pam stepped through the door and felt it shift, that smell. Felt it against her skin the way you felt a change in weather, a drop in pressure before a storm. Her throat warmed, the words stirred. She pressed them back down. "Your rooms are the eastern wing," said Sora's attendant, a lean young woman with close-cropped dark hair and careful eyes, who had spoken perhaps 12 words across the entire night's journey and seemed perfectly comfortable with that number. "You'll find a change of clothing and a meal. The priestess asks that you rest before your first examination this afternoon." Pam looked around the entrance hall. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the low ceiling beams in organized clusters. Yarrow, a mugwort, rosemary, others she recognized and others she didn't, their layered scents competing pleasantly with the wood smoke rising from the long hearth at the hall's end. Shelves lined the walls between the windows, crowded with jars and wrapped bundles and stacked texts, with cracked spines. A mortar the size of a soup bowl sat on the wide central table, stained dark with years of use. It was, Pam realized slowly, the home of someone who genuinely loved this work. That made her relax, slightly, more than she had intended to. She rested through the morning, genuinely rested, for the first time in longer than she could clearly recall, in a narrow bed with a straw mattress that smelled faintly of lavender, under a wool blanket thick enough to muffle the world. She slept without the usual dread of sleeping, without lying awake waiting for the heat to rise in her throat and the words to spill out into the dark. She slept simply, heavily, like someone who had been carrying something very heavy and had been briefly allowed to set it down. When she woke, Sora was waiting. The first examination was not what Pam had expected. She had braced herself for something cold and clinical, for the detached probing of a scholar encountering an interesting problem. What she found instead was a woman sitting in a high-backed chair across a wide oak table, 2 cups of something hot and fragrant already poured, her hands folded and her expression attentive in a way that felt, disconcertingly, like being seen. "Sit," Sora said. Pam sat. "Tell me how it began," Sora said. "Not the accusations, not what your parents told the council, what you felt, what you experienced from the very beginning." So Pam told her. It had started small, the way most things that eventually become enormous started. Quietly, almost forgettably. She had been 25, a few months past her last name day, standing alone at the edge of the forest at the end of an ordinary afternoon. The light had been going low and golden through the trees, the kind of light that arrived in autumn and stayed only briefly before the cold pushed it away. She had been thinking about nothing in particular, and then something had risen in her throat, and she had opened her mouth. And what had come out was not her language, not any language she had ever heard, and yet it had moved through her with the ease and certainty of something that had always lived there, only now finding its way out. She had stood alone in the forest for a long moment afterward, heart hammering, hand pressed to her mouth. She had not told anyone. Not at first. She had told herself it was a strange moment, an anomaly, the kind of inexplicable thing that happened once and was never repeated. She had gone home, eaten dinner, spoken ordinary words to her mother across the table, and held the experience at a careful distance, the way you held something hot enough to burn. But it came back. Of course it came back. 3 nights later, in the dark, she woke with the words already on her lips. Not a whisper this time, but a full resonant sound that filled her room and woke her mother in the next chamber. She heard her mother's quick footsteps, the door opening, and she pressed her face into the pillow and went silent. Her mother stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she went back to bed. After that, the episodes multiplied. Once every few days, then daily, then sometimes twice in a single afternoon. And the trance states began, moments where she lost time entirely, arriving back to herself minutes later with no memory of what had passed. only the faint resonance of ancient syllables in the air around her. And sometimes, she noticed with a fear she did not know how to name, the plants nearby stood slightly straighter. The herbs in her mother's kitchen garden leaned toward her as she moved past, the way flowers lean toward sun. She had tried everything to stop it, pressed her hands over her mouth until her lips ached, sung over it, bitten her own cheek until she tasted iron. Nothing worked. The episodes came when they came, indifferent to her attempts, and each time she failed to suppress one, the thing grew slightly more settled inside her, slightly more at home. She was trying to contain the tide with a cupped hand. Sora listened to all of it without interruption. She did not write anything down. She simply listened, her dark eyes level and attentive, occasionally nodding, and by the time Pam finished speaking, the tea in both cups had gone cold, and the afternoon light had shifted to its last hour. Sora was quiet for a long moment. "Show me," she said finally. Pam went still. "I can't simply... It doesn't come when I..." "You've been holding it down since you walked through my door," Sora said, not unkindly. "I can see it in your jaw, in your shoulders, in the way you sat down and immediately made yourself smaller. You have been managing this constantly for over a year." A pause. "Let it come. You are safe here. Nothing you say in this room will bring judgment." Pam looked at her for a long moment. Then she stopped holding it down. The warmth rose from her spine to her throat in a single fluid motion, like water finding the level it had always wanted. And then the words came, and they were not frightening in the way they had always felt frightening before, contained behind her teeth, and made monstrous by the pressure of suppression. Out in the open air, in this room that smelled of herbs and old texts, they were simply what they were. Ancient, layered, carrying harmonics she did not know the names for. She spoke for perhaps 30 seconds, and as she spoke, the dried herbs hanging from the beams above them trembled faintly. The 2 cold cups of tea steamed briefly. On the windowsill, a cluster of dried flowers that had been brittle and gray lifted their heads, slowly, as though turning toward a light source. Then it passed, and Pam sat in the sudden quiet, breathing carefully. She looked at Sora. Sora's expression had changed. She had been composed when Pam walked in, controlled, professional, arranged. Now she was very still in a different way, the stillness of someone who had just witnessed something that confirmed a theory they had spent a long time holding. Her dark eyes moved over Pam's face, and then to the flowers on the windowsill, still slightly lifted, then back to Pam's face. "I see," she said softly. Over the following weeks, the pattern of their days established itself. Examinations in the mornings, Sora asking questions, sometimes asking Pam to allow the episodes, and observing carefully, occasionally pressing dried herbs into her palms and watching what happened. Afternoons left to Pam, who spent them in the herb garden that ran along the southern wall, wild and organized in equal measure, the kind of garden tended by someone who understood that some things grew better when you trusted them. She was beginning to heal, not in any dramatic way. The uncomplicated girl she had been before the episodes was gone, and Pam was not naive about permanent things, but slowly, daily. The tightness in her chest that had lived there for over a year was easing. She let the words come when they came and did not fight them, and each time they faded, she noticed the garden looked slightly better than the day before. Her gift, she was beginning to understand, was not a corruption. It was a language, an ancient one, and it was not empty. It was Sora who confirmed it, on a gray morning in the 4th week, in the study with rain against the windows and the fire burning low. "You have been given a gift of ancient healing," Sora said, without preamble, without softening. "Sayni's the kind that has not been seen in this region in living memory, perhaps longer." She set down the text she had been reading, and folded her hands on the table. The language you speak is not a corruption. It is the language of the old healers, the ones who existed before the pacts, before the councils, before the structures we have built to organize the world. They communicated with living things, plants, the body's interior systems, wounds and sicknesses that resist ordinary medicine. They could heal what could not otherwise be healed. Pam sat very still. "What happened to them?" she asked. "They were feared," Sora said simply. "What is not understood is almost always feared first, and so they were reduced, hidden, their knowledge fragmented, eventually lost." She looked at Pam directly. "Until apparently now." The silence that followed was full of things Pam had not yet found words for. Relief, enormous and flooding, a name finally applied to something that had been nameless and therefore monstrous. And beneath the relief, anger gathering like distant weather. Quiet, not yet fully formed, the kind that starts far away and takes its time arriving. She thought of a year of terror, of her parents' faces, of wolfsbane cord and a crowd that had watched her walk between them. For this, for a gift. She pressed the anger down. Let the relief have its moment, but the weeks that followed brought something she had not anticipated. She began to notice what Sora was doing with the information. It started small. Visitors began arriving at the keep. Carefully selected visitors, a pack elder from 3 territories over, a merchant whose wife had an untreatable condition, a woman who said she had been told to come and would not say by whom. Sora would receive them privately, and then come to Pam. "I have a guest," she would say. "The woman is suffering from a wasting illness. I believe your gift may be relevant. Would you observe?" Pam would observe. She would feel the old warmth rising, the words forming, and she would look at the sick woman and feel, with a clarity that was new and growing, exactly where the illness lived inside her and what was needed. And Sora would watch, carefully, intently, in the particular way of someone who was not simply witnessing, but documenting, cataloging, accumulating. The visitors came more frequently. The consultations grew longer. Sora's manner toward her shifted in increments, a little more directive, a little less deferential, the consultations beginning to feel less like requests and more like assignments. One afternoon, Pam found a letter on Sora's writing table, unfolded, not hidden. It was addressed to a high council member 2 territories over, referring to Pam as Sora's discovery and her asset, describing the healings Pam had performed as Sora's work, the fruit of Sora's years of study. Pam set the letter back exactly as she had found it. She walked to the herb garden and stood among the rosemary and sage in the cool afternoon air. And the plants leaned toward her the way they always did. And she understood, with the clarity of cold water, exactly what kind of cage she had been placed in. Beautiful, scented with wood smoke and herbs, with a soft bed and a garden, and a woman who was genuinely interested in her gift. But the bars were there. They had always been there. Made from things that looked like kindness rather than things that looked like wolfsbane cord. She went back inside. That evening, at dinner, Sora spoke of an invitation she had received, a gathering of healers and scholars from across 3 packs, a significant occasion, a chance to present their findings. And she used the word there with such natural ease that Pam nearly let it pass. Nearly. "Our findings," Pam said. Sora looked up from her cup. Her expression was pleasant, attentive. "Yes?" "You said our findings." Pam kept her voice level. "But the letter on your writing table referred to me as your asset. And the healings you've been arranging. You are describing them to your correspondents as your research, not as the work of the person who is actually doing the healing." The silence in the room changed quality. Sora set her cup down with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a response. When she spoke, her voice was still even, still warm, with only the faintest additional weight beneath it. You are still very new to understanding your gift. What you can do is extraordinary, but extraordinary things require frameworks. Context. The credibility of an established institution to be taken seriously by the wider world. I provide that framework. I am not taking from you. I am ensuring your gift is received properly. Pam looked at her for a long moment. I was brought before the council for a death sentence, she said quietly. You intervened. I am grateful for that. Genuinely. But gratitude is not the same as belonging to you. Sora's expression remained smooth and composed, but something moved behind her eyes. A recalculation, swift and subtle. Be careful, Sora said softly. You are still under council sanction. My word is all that stands between you and a return to that square. The words landed cleanly, precisely, like they had been saved for exactly this moment. Pam held very still. Then she nodded once, stood, and excused herself from the table. She went to her room. She sat on the narrow bed in the dark and listened to the keep settle around her, and breathed steadily, and thought, with cold and growing clarity, about what she was going to do. She was not going back to that square, but she was not staying here either. She rose before the fire in the main hall had fully died, while the keep was still deep in the particular quiet of the hours before dawn. She moved with the care of someone who had spent weeks memorizing the sounds of this place, which floorboards spoke, how the arched door moved, where the corridor echoed. In the kitchen, she gathered what she needed: dried valerian, passion flower, skullcap, and the ghost-pale herb that grew in the shaded corner of the garden and had no name in any text she'd found, but whose properties she had spent weeks quietly learning. She ground them together by feel in the dark, and working the mortar with a slow and steady hand, adding dried chamomile flower to soften the bitterness, measuring by instinct refined over weeks of practice. Then she added the mixture to the embers of the evening fire in the hall, a small, dense bundle, wrapped in a broad leaf, placed directly onto the coals. The smoke rose slow and colorless at first, then fuller, threading through the keep in a low, quiet drift, following the corridors, finding the rooms where Sora and her two attendants slept. Pam stood in the hall and waited. Within 20 minutes, the keep was entirely, profoundly silent. She gathered her things, her satchel, her knowledge, the thick cloak she had been given on arrival, and every dried herb and wrapped preparation she had made over the past weeks, carefully sorted and packed. She paused at the door of the study and looked at the shelves of texts, at the wide oak table, at the 2 cold cups still sitting where they had sat during that first examination. She thought of the woman who had listened to her story without interrupting, who had told her she was safe in this room. She had not been wrong about the safety. She had only been wrong about its price. Pam opened the arched door and stepped out into the pre-dawn dark, and the northern pines rose on either side of her, and the cold air tasted of frost and distance, and the words came to her throat softly, like a greeting, ancient and warm and unhurried, as if whatever lived inside her had been waiting for exactly this: the open world, the uncontrolled air, the first step of a road that belonged to no one but her. She walked north. She did not look back at the beautiful keep with its ivy walls and its careful garden and its elegant proprietary cage. She walked for a long time without stopping. The northern forest was dark and dense around her, the pines pressing close, their resin sharp in the cold air. No torch, no lantern. She had not brought one, and she found she did not need one. The path showed itself in increments, pale root and pale stone catching what little light the sky offered, and she moved through the dark with a sureness she had not known she possessed until this moment. As if the forest recognized her the way the garden had. As if the ground itself leaned toward her, and gently, here is solid, here you will not fall. She did not think about Sora. She did not think about the square, or her father's good cloak, or the wolfsbane cord. She thought about nothing but forward. Then the trees thinned, and she stepped into a wide clearing where the sky opened above her. Vast and gray-violet, the last of the night retreating at its edges, dawn pressing up from the east like something done with being held under. She stopped. The clearing demanded it, the way certain silences demanded to be listened to rather than filled. And then, not forced, not suppressed, not managed, the words came. Softly at first, more vibration than voice, rising through her chest and out into the open air. She did not fight them. She did not cup her hand over her mouth. She let them come fully, and they were beautiful in the way of things that have been contained too long and are finally, completely, free. The clearing responded. The frost-pale grass at her feet lifted slowly, blade by blade, until it stood upright like a held breath. At the tree line, winter herbs she had only just learned to name glowed faintly at their tips. Not fire, not storybook magic, but something biological and ancient and alive. A bird she could not see began to call from the high branches, a sound she had never heard before and would remember for the rest of her life. The words faded. The clearing settled. Pam stood in the center of it, boots wet with frost, satchel across her chest, hands loose at her sides, not gripping anything, not bracing for anything, not holding herself in. She was 25 years old. She had survived a death sentence and a beautiful cage, and a night alone in a forest that had no obligation to be kind to her, and had been kind anyway. She had been desired, then feared, then offered up like something expendable. She had been kept like a secret. She had been every kind of thing belonging to every kind of person who was not her. She was done with that now. She looked at the pale dawn breaking above the tree line and felt something settle inside her with the quiet finality of a latch finding its home. Not a slam, not a shattering. Just the small, decisive click of a thing becoming closed. She did not need saving. She did not need a keeper. She needed a place, quiet, her own, and she would build it. Pam adjusted her satchel strap, turned her face toward the east and the climbing light, and walked on. Alone. Deliberate. Belonging entirely to herself for the first time in her life. Behind her, in the clearing, the frost-pale grass stayed upright long after she had gone. The winter herbs kept their faint, sourceless glow, as if the forest was marking where she had stood, as if even the land wanted to remember. She built the cabin with her own hands. Not quickly, nothing worth keeping was ever done quickly, but steadily, the way she did everything now, with the particular patience of a woman who had learned that urgency belonged to other people's timelines, not her own. She found the place 2 days east of where she had emerged from the northern wood, on a gentle rise where the land curved like a cupped palm, and a cold, clear stream ran below it, threading between mossy stones with a sound like low conversation. The trees here were older than the ones near Sora's keep, their trunks wide enough that she could press her back against one and feel held. Their canopy was dense enough to muffle wind, but generous enough to let through long columns of afternoon light that moved across the forest floor as the day turned, slow and gold and unhurried. The first time she stood on that rise and let the words come freely, the trees leaned. Every one of them. A long, collective inclination. Barely perceptible. Like a bow. Like acknowledgement. She had knelt in the soil and pressed both palms flat against it, and felt the warmth beneath her hands answer back. This was where she would stay. The cabin took 3 weeks. She felled small timber, stripped bark, fitted joints with a precision that surprised her until she understood that her hands knew things her mind hadn't caught up with yet. That the gift that lived in her tongue also lived in her fingers, like that healing and building were not so different when the intention behind both was to make something that endured. She filled gaps with clay from the stream bank, dried herbs pressed into the mortar to keep rot away. She built a window facing east so she would wake to light, She built a shelf along the southern wall, long enough for every preparation she would ever make. She built it for herself, for no other purpose, for no audience. And when it was finished and she stood inside it with the smell of new timber and dried herbs and cold stream air all around her, she felt something she had no word for. Not happiness exactly, because happiness had always struck her as a thin and temporary thing. This was deeper, quieter, the sensation of a body that has finally, after a very long time of bracing, been allowed to simply stand in its own shape. She had been living alone on the rise for 6 weeks when she found the man. It was dusk, and she had gone down to the stream to refill her water jars, the light going low and amber through the pines, the cold water numbing her fingers as she worked. She almost missed him entirely. He had fallen in the undergrowth at the base of the old oak 20 paces upstream, half hidden by the root system that pushed up from the earth in thick, tangled arches, his dark traveling cloak blending into the shadow. What caught her eye was the smell. Even at that distance, even over the clean, cold scent of the stream and the resin of the pines, she caught it. Something sharp and wrong beneath the surface of the ordinary wood smells. Something her gift recognized before her mind did. She set her jars down and went to him. He was a grown man, heavy-set, with a broad jaw and rough-cut hair that had gone damp with sweat despite the cold of the evening. He had been unconscious long enough that his skin was already cool to the touch at his extremities, his lips gone the wrong shade of gray. His breathing, when she pressed her ear close, was labored and wet, each pull of air rattling somewhere deep in his chest like something loose in a locked room. His right hand was blistered at the palm and wrist. At the center of his forearm, just visible beneath the rolled cuff of his sleeve, was a small wound. Barely a wound at all. More like a puncture, ringed in a dark bruise that had already spread outward further than any bruise from a simple wound had any right to travel. Poison. Something fast-acting, and it had been inside him long enough to be well advanced. Pam sat back on her heels and looked at him in the fading light. She did not know this man. He had not come to her door. He had not asked her for anything. He was simply a stranger who had managed to fall the wrong way in the forest before the poison finished its work. And now he was here in front of her. And he was dying. She felt the familiar warmth stir at the base of her throat. Patient. Waiting. She had healed small things before. Her own minor ailments. A bird with a broken wing she had found near the cabin in her second week. The ghost-pale herb in her garden that had been struggling and had responded to her spoken words by tripling its growth in 3 days. She had felt the gift stretching as she learned to use it freely, and the way a muscle developed when no longer told to stay still. But she had not healed a dying person yet. Not outside of Sora's carefully managed demonstrations. Not alone, in the dark, with no one watching and no framework and nothing but herself and whatever lived inside her. She was afraid. She pressed both hands to his chest anyway. The words came hard and fast, not the gentle release of a controlled demonstration, but something with urgency in it. The same ancient syllables but driven now, purposeful, the difference between a river at low flow and a river in flood. She felt the poison immediately, the way she had felt the wrongness of things before, but this was sharper and more complex, a presence that had threaded itself through his blood and his organs with the deliberate patience of something that had been designed specifically to spread and resist and destroy. She felt it pushing back against her, not with intelligence, but with the blunt, impersonal resistance of a thing fulfilling its nature. She pushed harder. The warmth in her palms deepened until it was almost heat. A living heat, flowing through the layers of his clothing and into his body, with a precision she could feel rather than see. Finding the poison where it had pooled in the chambers of his heart, in the tissue of his lungs, in the blood moving sluggishly through his veins. She spoke to each pocket of it in turn, and each time she felt the response, faint at first and then stronger. the ancient language working at the poison the way water worked at salt. Not with violence, but with a patient, to total persistence that left the poison nowhere to hold. It took longer than anything she had done before. The light failed entirely. She worked by firefly glow and the faint luminescence that her own hands threw off in the dark. She noticed this without surprise, as though she had always known her hands could do this, and had simply not had occasion to need them to. The stream ran on below them, unconcerned. The pines stood their watch. When she finally sat back, her arms trembling with exhaustion, the man's breathing had changed. Slow, deep, even. The gray had left his lips. The dark bruise at his forearm had begun, visibly, to shrink back toward the wound's center, the poison retreating through the same channels it had advanced through. Defeated not by force, but by something older and more fundamental. She sat in the dark beside a stranger she had pulled back from the edge of death with nothing but her hands and her voice. And she breathed, and she felt the exhaustion and the triumph in equal measure, and underneath both of them something that was neither. A deep, settled knowing that she had just used her gift the way it had always been meant to be used. Not in demonstration, not under observation, not to build someone else's reputation, to save a life that would otherwise have ended alone in the dark. The man stirred before midnight. He woke confused and frightened, understandably, coming conscious in a forest in the dark, with a stranger sitting beside him. And Pam stayed still and kept her voice even, and told him what had happened without embellishment. He stared at her for a long time. He looked at his arm, at the wound which was already closing cleanly, at the bruise which was now barely visible. "You saved me," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Yes," Pam said simply. He looked at the dark forest around them, and at the rise above where the warm window of her cabin glowed through the trees, and back at her. "Who are you?" he asked. "A healer," she said. And it was the first time she had said those exact words in that exact order, and they settled into the air between them and into her own chest with the particular weight of things that are simply and completely true. She helped him up to the cabin, fed him broth, and let him sleep on the floor by the hearth. By morning he was steady on his feet, the color back in his face, his movements unimpaired. He stood at her door before he left and looked at her with the careful, unperformed respect of a man who had been given back something he had not expected to keep. "I travel through 5 territories in my trade," he said. "I will not forget what you did here." She had not asked him to remember. She had not asked him to tell anyone. She had asked nothing at all. But a trader's routes were long and his stops were many, and by the time a month had passed, word had moved faster than she had anticipated. Not the careful, managed spread of Sora's cultivated reputation, but something rawer and more immediate, passed between people at crossroads and market stalls and settlement fires in the plain, ungarnished language of someone describing a thing they had personally witnessed. "There is a healer in the northern wood. She found me dying in the forest. She did not know me. She healed me anyway." That word spread the way word always spread in the territories. Slowly at first, then all at once. It came next with a child. A small boy from a settlement 2 hours south, carried to her door by a mother whose face held the particular blank exhaustion of someone who had been afraid for so long that the fear had stopped feeling like fear and had simply become the texture of every day. The boy had a fever that had not broken in 8 days. His lips were cracked. His small chest moved in rapid, shallow pulls that made Pam think of something running out. She did not hesitate. She brought them inside, set the boy on her wide workbench, pressed her hands against his sternum and his brow, and let the words rise without ceremony or fanfare. Simply let the ancient language do what it had always been trying to do, now that there was no one telling it to stop. The warmth moved through her palms and into the child, and she felt the fever the way she felt everything now when she healed. As a presence, a specific and locatable wrongness, a knot in the body's conversation with itself. She spoke to it in the only language it understood. She felt it loosen, unravel, release. The boy's breathing slowed and deepened within minutes. By the time the last of the words had faded from the air of the cabin, he was sleeping, his color already warmer, his small fists uncurled against the workbench. His mother wept. Then she offered Pam everything she had brought: a bag of grain, dried meat, a length of good wool. Pam took the wool. She left the food. "Tell no one," she said, not because she feared discovery, but because she was not yet ready for what would follow if she didn't have the chance to choose it herself. The mother nodded. She told everyone. Within a month, they were coming steadily. The sick, the desperate, the ones who had been told by every conventional healer that nothing more could be done. A man with a wound that had gone black at the edges and smelled of deep infection. An elderly woman who had not spoken in 2 years after a fever burned through her mind and left silence where language had been. A young wolf whose shift had become agonizing, something in the mechanism of his change torn or misfiring, each transformation leaving him wrecked for days afterward. Pam healed them all. Not because she was obligated, not because anyone had told her to, not because she owed the world anything. She had settled that particular debt clearly on the morning she walked out of Sora's keep with her satchel and her knowledge and her own 2 feet. She healed because this was what the gift was for. Because healing did not ask who deserved it before it worked. Because when she placed her hands on a suffering body and felt that ancient warmth moving through her, she understood, with the deep and sourceless certainty of things that are simply true, that this was the purpose underneath her purpose. The reason something so old had chosen someone so young and specific and seemingly expendable to carry it forward. Fate, she thought sometimes, standing in her cabin doorway at dusk with her hands still warm from a healing, watching the long light come through the old trees. Fate had a particular sense of humor. It had let her be offered up for judgment, or let her stand before a death sentence in a packed square at dusk with wolfsbane cord at her wrists. Let her be caged in a beautiful keep by a woman who wanted to own what she carried. And through all of it, the gift had not left her, had not diminished, had not bent to anyone else's purpose. It had simply waited, with the patience of something that knew exactly where it was going, for her to come into herself enough to carry it properly. She was carrying it properly now. Her reputation grew the way the keeps had grown under Sora, but differently. Sora had cultivated reputation like a garden, pruned and directed, and arranged for maximum visibility. Pam's grew wild, which meant it grew true. People spoke of her in the honest, unembellished language of people who had been genuinely helped. The healer in the northern wood, the woman who speaks and the sickness answers. She does not turn anyone away. She does not ask who you are or where you come from. She asks only what hurts. It was on a morning in early spring, the ground soft with snowmelt, the first green things pushing up through the dark soil of her garden, the stream running fast and cold and loud below the rise. That he came, she knew he was not ordinary before she saw his face. She had heard them coming for several minutes. 2 horses, moving at a deliberate pace, not urgent, not the desperate gallop of people bringing a dying person on horseback. Measured, considered, the pace of people who had been traveling long enough to be careful about how they arrived. She had been in the garden, hands in the soil, coaxing a late germinating herb back toward the light, and she had straightened and wiped her hands on her apron and turned toward the sound. 2 riders emerged from the tree line. The one slightly behind was clearly an attendant, watchful, contained, the practiced invisibility of someone whose role was to observe and not to be observed. The one in front was the reason she had known before seeing. He was dressed plainly, deliberately so. A traveling cloak with no insignia, no embellishment, no announcement of any kind. But plainness, Pam had learned, was its own kind of signal on the right body. There was something about the way he moved that could not be undressed down to ordinary. no matter how ordinary the clothing. The way he rode, not with the display of men who wanted to be watched, but with the settled, she unperformed authority of someone who had never needed to perform it, because it had always simply been true. Broad through the shoulders, still in the face, but a living stillness, attentive behind its surface. He dismounted without theater and looked at her directly. His eyes were dark, and they were doing what Pam had learned to recognize as the look of someone who had come expecting one thing and arrived at something else entirely. "I was told there was a healer," he said. His voice was low and even, and carried in it the particular quality of voices accustomed to being the last word in a room. "There is," Pam said. She did not move from where she stood, hands still bearing traces of garden soil, feet planted in her own earth. She had stopped apologizing for how she looked when people arrived. "Who are you, and what hurts?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile, not quite. "A traveler," he said, curious about what people are saying across 3 territories about a healer in the northern wood. "Travelers usually have names." "Silas," he said, after a beat that told her the pause was a decision rather than a hesitation. She studied him. He studied her back with equal frankness, and she found that she did not mind it. His gaze was not the kind that tried to take something. It was the kind that was genuinely trying to see. "Are you sick, Silas?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then you can water your horses at the stream and tell me what you actually came for." He did, and he told her. Not in that first conversation, which was careful and circling and interesting in the way of 2 people who are intelligent enough to know they are measuring each other, and honest enough not to pretend otherwise. He came back the following week, and the week after that. He helped her repair the eastern corner of the cabin roof, where a winter branch had split the timber. He brought herbs she had mentioned needing, and said nothing about where he had sourced them. He sat across her workbench in the evenings while she prepared her medicines, and asked her questions that were genuinely curious. About the gift. About how it felt from the inside. About what she thought it meant that something this old had survived in a single person, when everything else of its kind had been lost. He never asked her to explain herself. He never looked at her with the particular combination of fascination and proprietary interest that Sora had worn like a second robe. He simply looked at her the way she was finding, slowly, and with a caution she could not entirely abandon, that she wanted to be looked at, as a person who was complete and capable and interesting entirely on her own terms, whose gift was a part of her rather than the sum of her. She was not naive. She understood what was happening between them. She let it happen slowly, in her own time, at the pace she set. And he matched that pace without complaint or negotiation, which told her more about him than anything he could have said outright. It was on his 7th visit that he told her. They were sitting outside in the early evening, the sky going the particular deep blue of spring dusk, the stream audible below them, the first fireflies of the season beginning their tentative appearances at the tree line. She had been watching one hover near the wild garlic at the garden's edge when he said, without preamble and without apology, "I should tell you who I am. I should have told you before now." Pam looked at him. She had known something was held back. She had chosen not to press it, the way she chose not to press anything she had not been offered. "Silas," he said, "Alpha King of the Northern and Eastern Territories, all 5 of them." The firefly drifted into the garlic and disappeared. Pam was quiet for a long moment. "You came in plain clothes," she said finally. "I wanted to see you as you were. Not as you would be if you knew you were being observed by someone with authority over your future." She considered that. It was not the worst reason she had ever heard for a deception. It was, in fact, almost the only reason for that particular deception she could respect. "And now?" she asked. He turned to face her fully. The settled stillness of him was the same as it had always been. No performance added now that the title was on the table. No expansion of presence to match the announcement. He was exactly who he had been on every other visit. "I want to make you my Luna," he said, "my queen. I want to give you a name that no council in any territory can threaten, a standing that makes what happened in that square impossible to repeat, a life that is, if you want it, alongside mine." The stream ran below them. A night bird began somewhere in the old trees. Pam looked at her hands in her lap, hands that had built this cabin and healed a child's fever and coaxed late herbs back toward light, hands that were hers, that had always been hers, even when everything else had been taken or offered or nearly condemned. "I love what I do here," she said. "I know," Silas said. "I'm not asking you to stop. I love this place, like these trees, this stream. I built this with my own hands, and I healed people here who had no one else. And that is not something I will set aside for a title or a palace or even—" She paused. "Even for someone I have come to care for considerably." "I am not asking you to set it aside," he said, and his voice was quiet and entirely certain. "I am asking if there is room, in the life you have built entirely on your own terms, not for one more thing that is also yours." The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind that held things without needing to announce them. She looked at him for a long time. "Ask me again in a month," she said. "When the spring planting is done." He nodded once. He did not argue. He did not negotiate. He stood, took his cloak from the step where he had set it, and said good evening the way he always said good evening, quietly, without claim, as if her answer, whatever it turned out to be, was something he would receive and not contest. She watched him ride back into the trees with his attendant behind him, and she breathed in the cool spring night and the smell of her own garden, and she felt, underneath everything, the quiet and sourceless warmth that she had come to trust absolutely. The month passed. She planted, she healed, she tended her garden and her stream and her old trees, and the people who found their way to her rise with their illnesses, and their desperation, and their genuine gratitude. She thought carefully, in the unhurried way she now did everything, about what she wanted. Not what was offered. Not what was expected. What she, Pamela Dawnfield, who had been offered up for judgment at 25, and had built her own world at 26, with nothing but her hands and her gift, and her absolute refusal to be reducible, what she actually wanted for the rest of her life. She knew the answer before the month was out. She had known it for a while, probably. But knowing and choosing were two different things, and she had learned, at considerable cost, the importance of letting herself choose. It was on the last day of the month, with the spring planting finished and the garden standing straight and green and fragrant in the morning light, that the sound of horses came again from the south. She turned and stopped. Not Silas. 2 horses moving slowly. Slowly enough to suggest either great exhaustion or great reluctance, or both. She recognized the first horse before she recognized the riders. A bay she had known since childhood, gone gray around the muzzle now, plodding with the quiet determination of an old animal that had walked too far. She recognized the man in the saddle next. Her father. He was thin. The good cloak, the dark one with the silver clasp, hung from his shoulders as if there was less of him inside it than there should be. His face, as he came clear of the tree line, was the face of a man who had been sick for a long time and knew it, on the particular translucence of someone whose body was working harder than it should have to on the simple business of continuing. He was not sitting fully upright. Her mother rode close beside him, one hand extended, not quite touching his arm, hovering there in the helpless way of a person watching something they cannot stop. Her mother saw her first. She pulled her horse to a halt at the edge of the rise and sat very still for a moment, she looking at Pam standing in front of the cabin she had built, in her garden, in her boots, on her land, in the life she had constructed from nothing after everything had been taken from her. Her mother's face did something complicated, and then went very still, the way a face went still when it encountered something it had not prepared itself for. Then her mother dismounted, and she walked to the foot of the rise, and she knelt. Not a small gesture, not the kind of kneel that maintained dignity while technically performing humility. She knelt fully, her knees pressing into the soft spring earth, her hands clasped in front of her. And when she raised her face to look at Pam, her eyes were not wet. They were the beyond wet of someone who has been crying for a long time and is now in the dry, raw place past tears. "My daughter," she said. Her voice was barely sound. "We heard of the healer in the northern wood. We did not know. I did not let myself believe." She stopped. Started again with visible effort. "Your father is very ill. The local healers say there is nothing more they can do. I did not know where else to go." Pam stood on her rise and looked at the woman who had clasped her hands at her waist and looked at the ground and said nothing while a death sentence was laid at her daughter's feet. Who had let her father's restraining hand keep her from taking one step forward? The silence was long. It had weight, that silence. It held a year of terror, and a square full of torchlight, and a cord of wolfsbane burning at her wrists, and a crowd of faces she had known all her life, rearranged into walls of judgment. It held a girl who had been desired and then feared, and then offered up, and who had survived it without any help from the two people who should, above all others, have stood in front of it. Pam breathed. "Bring him inside," she said. Her mother made a small sound, relief so acute it was almost grief, and rose and turned back to her father, helping him down from the horse with the careful gentleness of someone handling something precious, and fragile, and possibly irreplaceable. Pam went inside and prepared her workbench and washed her hands and let the warmth come up slowly, already readying itself, because the gift had always known what it was for, and it did not require her personal feelings to function. That was the thing about true healing. It did not ask whether the person deserved it. It simply asked whether it was needed. Her father was lowered onto the bench, gray-faced, his breathing labored, and she pressed her hands to his chest and his brow, and she felt the illness inside him immediately. Deep-rooted, systemic. The kind that had been growing quietly for longer than anyone had noticed. The kind that had been feeding on the body's energy reserves until the reserves were nearly spent. She spoke. The ancient words filled the cabin, unhurried, layered, precise in the way of things that knew exactly what they were addressing. She felt the illness resist, the way serious illness always did, the way anything entrenched resisted being asked to leave. She spoke through the resistance. She felt the warmth in her palms deepen, intensify, flowing through her father's sternum in a steady and deliberate current. Her mother stood at the edge of the room, on hands pressed together against her mouth, absolutely silent. It took longer than the child's fever had taken. Deep illness always did. But she felt the shift, the moment the resistance broke, the way ice cracked on a river in the first real thaw of spring, sudden and definitive and leaving something clearer behind it. Her father's breathing deepened. The gray left his face slowly, like weather moving on. By the time the last word had dissolved into the warm air of the cabin, he was sleeping, his chest rising and falling in the slow, even rhythm of a body that had been given back the energy it needed to heal itself the rest of the way. Pam stepped back. She felt the particular exhaustion of a deep healing. Not weakness, but the specific tiredness of something that had been fully spent in the right direction. She steadied herself against the workbench edge. Her mother moved. She came forward, and for a moment Pam thought she was going to kneel again, and she was already preparing the words to tell her not to. But her mother stopped a foot away, and she looked at Pam, and what was in her face was not supplication. It was something rawer and less composed than that, something that had been sitting behind her eyes for a long time and had given up trying to stay arranged. "I should have stepped forward," her mother said. In the square. When your father—" She stopped. I should have stepped forward, and I did not. You and I have not slept an unbroken night since. Pam looked at her. He is healed, she said quietly. He will need rest and good food and 3 weeks before he attempts the journey home. You may stay in the clearing below the rise. There is shelter enough. Her mother nodded. Her jaw was working. Pam. Forgiveness, Pam said, and her voice was not cold, but it was clear, like the clarity of a woman who had done the hard work of understanding the difference between what she owed the world and what the world owed her. Is not something I can give you this afternoon. It may come. I believe eventually it will come, because I am not a person who can carry hatred and do what I do, and I have no intention of being anything other than what I am. She met her mother's eyes directly. But it will come in its own time. Not because you need it, because I choose it. Her mother's face crumpled, then it steadied. She nodded once, a small, real nod, without theater. That is more than I deserve, she said. Yes, Pam agreed, not unkindly, simply truly. Pam was at her workbench preparing a poultice when she heard the third set of hooves that day. She stilled. She knew the sound before she reached the door. Not because she recognized the specific horse, but because there was a quality to the approach. Measured, deliberate, arriving without urgency and without the hesitance of someone who was unsure of their welcome. That she had come to associate with a particular kind of person, on someone who had decided something before they set out and had not changed their mind on the road. She opened the door. Priestess Sora dismounted at the foot of the rise alone. No attendants, no entourage, none of the careful human architecture with which she usually surrounded herself. She was dressed simply, for travel, her gray robes exchanged for a plain, dark cloak, her silver-streaked hair loose rather than drawn back in its customary precision. She looked, without the ceremony stripped away, older than Pam had realized, and smaller. And for the first time in all the months Pam had known her, uncertain. She climbed the rise slowly. She stopped 3 paces from the door and looked at Pam, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Sora said, I owe you an accounting. Pam leaned against the doorframe and waited. I told myself I was protecting you, Sora said. Her voice was even, but the evenness had a different quality to it than the composed, weaponized evenness Pam remembered from the keep. This was the flatness of someone who had removed the performance and was left with only the plain words. I told myself that your gift needed containment, direction, an established framework. That without me, the world would either destroy what you were or use it worse than I intended to. A pause. I was not entirely wrong about the world, but I was entirely wrong about my right to make that decision for you. Pam said nothing. She had no anger left for Sora. She had spent it cleanly on the morning she walked out through the arched door, and she had not picked it back up since. What remained was something quieter and more permanent. Not forgiveness, not yet. But the clear-eyed recognition of a person who had made a choice she understood and could not excuse. I went to the council, Sora said. Pam's eyes sharpened. After you left. Sora met her gaze directly, and this at least had not changed. She was still a woman who delivered difficult truths without looking away from them. I presented my full findings to Elder Kale and the full council. Everything I had documented about your gift. Its origin, its nature, its history among the ancient healers. I told them in terms they could not dispute or dismiss that what they had called spirit corruption was in fact a divine endowment. That you were not cursed. She paused. That you were chosen. The word landed in the space between them and stayed there. Chosen. The same word the council had been prepared to condemn. The same gift they had looked at and called darkness because darkness was the only name they had for things they did not recognize. They have formally revoked the accusation, Sora continued. Your name is cleared in every territory under the council's reach. On no authority in this pack or any neighboring pack can bring a renewed charge against you on these grounds." She paused once more, and what moved across her face then was genuine, unguarded, and too late, but real. "You were never what they called you. I should have told them that the night I took you from the square instead of waiting until it served my conscience to do so." Pam was quiet for a long time. The stream ran below them. A woodlark called once from the old pines and went silent. "Why now?" Pam asked finally. "What changed?" Sora looked at her steadily. "I heard what you built here. I heard about the traitor you pulled back from death in the forest alone at night, in your 6th week of freedom. I heard about the child, the others." She paused. "I heard about all of it, and I understood that everything I had told myself, that you needed me, that the gift needed managing, like that you were not ready, was a story I had told myself so I didn't have to face what I actually was." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I was a woman who found something extraordinary and called it mine." The admission sat between them, clean and unadorned. Pam pushed off the doorframe and stood straight. "Then you have done something worth doing," Pam said. "Whatever the reason it took you this long to do it." She did not invite Sora inside. She did not offer tea or a place to rest, or the warmth of the hearth. But she held the priestess's gaze without coldness and without warmth, with only the clear and level regard of a woman who had looked at every person who had shaped her story and decided one by one what they were owed. Sora received this without protest. She seemed, if anything, to have expected nothing more and perhaps slightly less. "I hope," she said quietly, "that what you are building here continues to grow." "It will," Pam said, simply, certainly. Sora nodded once. She turned and descended the rise and mounted her horse without hurry, and she rode back into the trees the way she had come, alone, without ceremony, carrying the particular quiet of someone who had arrived at a reckoning too late, and knew it, and had come anyway. Pam watched her go until the gray of her cloak dissolved into the shadows of the pines. She worked through the late afternoon in the particular silence of a day that has already asked everything of a person, and is now, finally, releasing them. The light through her east-facing window went from gold to amber, to the deep, soft rose of early evening. The stream below the rise caught the colors, and held them briefly before letting them go. She was at the doorway, washing her hands in a basin of cold water, when she heard it. One horse, coming from the north. Not from the south, say where the road led back to the pack territories, where her parents had come from, and Sora had come from, and every difficult thing that day had come from. From the north, the direction of open land and long roads traveled by choice rather than obligation. She went still with her hands in the water and listened, and she knew the pace of it before the tree line broke. She would have known it anywhere by now. Measured, unhurried, the sound of someone who had never needed to announce himself because his presence had always been enough. Silas emerged from the pines alone, as he always came, his plain traveling cloak dark against the last of the evening light. He saw her in the doorway and drew his horse to a gentle stop at the foot of the rise. He did not dismount immediately. He simply looked at her, the way he always looked at her, with that quiet, living attention that asked for nothing and missed nothing. And then he looked at the two horses in the clearing below, and back at her face, and understood, without being told, that the day had been a long and significant one. He dismounted. He tied his horse at the post she had built at the base of the rise for exactly this purpose, which told its own quiet story, and he climbed the 3 short steps of the path and stopped in front of her. "You don't have to tell me anything tonight," he said. Pam looked at him in the rose-gold evening light, this man who had come to her in plain clothes so she could see him plainly, who had fixed her roof and brought her herbs, and sat across her workbench asking questions that were genuinely curious, and never once looked at her gift the way Sora had. never once looked at her the way anyone before him had, who had asked her to make room for him in the life she had built entirely on her own terms, and then waited, without pressure, without negotiation, without taking up any more space than she invited him to take, for an entire month, because she had asked him to. The planting was done. The month was out. Every person from her past had come today and been given what they were owed. Her father his healing, her mother her honest answer, Sora her clear and level regard. Every account settled, every chain examined and set down. She was standing in the doorway of the life she had built from nothing, and she was whole. And the man in front of her was not here to complete her, or rescue her, or own what she carried. He was here because she was interesting and extraordinary and worth knowing, and he had taken the time to understand the difference. "The month is out," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Careful, not yet certain, giving her all the room there was. "It is," he said quietly. "Ask me again," Pam said. He was still for a single heartbeat. Then with the same settled and unperformed certainty that had always lived in him, the certainty that had nothing to do with titles or territories or the 5 kingdoms he governed, and everything to do with simply knowing what was true, he said, "Will you have me, Pamela Dawnfield? Not as a possession, not as a subject. As mine and I as yours in equal measure, not for as long as you choose it." The evening air was cool and carried the scent of her garden, rosemary and wild garlic, and the ghost-pale herb that had no name. And the stream ran below the rise with its low, steady conversation. And the old trees stood their patient watch at the edge of the clearing. And Pam felt the ancient warmth rise in her chest. Not to her throat this time. Not into language, but simply spreading outward through her the way warmth spread through cold hands held close to a fire. Slow, total, and completely certain. "Yes," she said. It was the simplest word she had ever spoken. It held no grief and no apology and no shadow of every time she had been reduced or condemned or offered up like something expendable. It held only what it was, a choice made freely, in full knowledge, by a woman who had earned the right to mean it completely. Silas stepped forward, and she stepped forward, and his hands came up to cup her face with a gentleness that understood, without needing to be told, exactly how much she had survived to arrive at this moment. She felt his thumbs at her cheekbones, warm and steady, and she tilted her face up to his. And when he kissed her, it was not urgent or consuming or anything that tried to take. It was quiet and deep and thorough. The kiss of 2 people who had been circling something true for a long time and were finally, with full intention, stepping into it. The old trees leaned, faintly, the way they always did when she was near. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers, his hands still cradling her face, both of them breathing the same evening air, and she could feel his heartbeat. Steady, a little faster than usual, entirely his. She pulled back enough to look at his face. It was doing something between composure and the particular expression of a man recalculating his immediate future, and she found, to her own surprise, that it made her laugh. A real laugh, unguarded, rising up through her chest and out into the evening air. The kind she had almost forgotten she was capable of during the long year of terror and the months of careful rebuilding. He looked at her laughing, and his expression settled into something warm and unhurried, and entirely certain. She was still smiling when he kissed her again, slower this time, in the last of the evening light, with the garden standing green and purposeful around them, and the stream running its steady course below, and the old trees bearing witness the way old things bore witness, without judgment, without condition, simply present for the things that mattered. Fate, she thought, had a particular sense of humor. It had taken everything from her, and through the taking had given her something no one could ever offer up, condemn, cage, or claim. It had given her herself, And from that single, extraordinary, indestructible thing, she had built everything else. And now, standing in the doorway of all of it, with her face tipped up toward a man who had chosen her freely and been chosen freely in return, she understood what the ancient warmth had always been trying to tell her. Not just that she was gifted, not just that she was chosen, but that she was exactly where fate had always been bringing her. Not to a place, not to a title, to herself, complete and certain and wholly, finally free. The stream ran below the rise. The old trees stood their patient watch. The spring light lay warm across the garden, and the herbs stood straight and green and purposeful in their rows, and Pamela Dawnfield, healer, stood in the doorway of the life she had made and breathed, and was whole. If this story found something in you, if you felt Pam's journey in your chest the way a good story is supposed to be felt, then you already know this world has more to give. There are more women like Pam waiting in these pages. More gifts misunderstood. More fates that refuse to be condemned. More love that came not as rescue but as recognition. Subscribe so you don't miss a single one. Leave a comment and tell me which part of Pam's story stayed with you longest. I read everyone. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about a woman who built herself back from nothing, send this to them. I'll see you in the next one.